Welcome to the inaugural episode of Roles Talk, where we discuss a variety of issues relating to international politics and security. This series aims to facilitate discussions to better understand the developments and their implications, as well as what could or needs to be done. I'm your host, Ryo Hinata-Yamaguchi, Project Assistant Professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology of the University of Tokyo. In this special inaugural episode, I'm joined by my great friend of many years, Dr. Collin Koh Swee Lean, Research Fellow at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, based in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Collin is one of the leading experts on naval issues and maritime security, with particular focus on the Southeast Asia region. I've known Collin now for about 10 years, and I've always enjoyed my on and off duty chats with him, and his insights on naval affairs have been very enlightening. And so I thought Collin is the perfect person to start this Roles Talk series. So Collin, thank you very much, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rio. We have known each other for so many years, and I always been looking for the opportunity to work with you. And thank you so much for having me on your inaugural discussion. It is an honor, and I thought it's a good way to start off our collaboration in the future. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. It's great. And so, Collin, we both work on defense and security related issues in the Indo-Pacific. And obviously, there's a lot of things we can talk about, but if we get carried away, we'll be going on forever and ever and ever. So let's, start with some specific issues here that are very important to us. And one of the most talked about issues in the Indo-Pacific is obviously China, right? And so the question is, well, what do you think are the most significant developments concerning the People's Liberation Army Navy in recent years?
Well, thank you so much. This is a question that will back quite a bit of perspective, because the existing commentaries out there have mostly focused on the hardware and the software build-up. We're talking about the phenomenal growth of the surface combatant fleet, and to some extent, the growth of the submarine capability. The latter aspect is less well known, not so much because there is no interest in it, but more because there is a much less information that transpire out of the build-up. So overall, since Xi Jinping became the leader of China, there has been an unprecedented growth in the overall capability of the PLA Navy, especially when it comes to the move or the transition from a largely coastal defense force to a blue water navy, right? So for today, as we saw, the PLA Navy is truly a blue water navy. Still not yet to the point of becoming a global navy like what the US Navy has been the case, right? I mean, the US Navy still remains the undisputed global navy, but we all could agree that the gap between the US Navy and the PLA Navy is closing when it comes to hardware. I mean, if you look at the average age of the new PLA Navy ships, they are way younger compared to the existing fleet of the US Navy. And of course, when it comes to the replacement or new build construction coming into the picture, the rate of growth is much slower compared to the PLA Navy. Of course, there are some more skeptical view about to what extent the PLA Navy will be able to sustain such a large fleet. Is there sufficient crew to man the fleet? Is there sufficient money to run the maintenance, repairs, and overhaul? These are legitimate questions, and of course, much of it backs quite a bit of guesstimate or quite a bit of informed guess about what exactly is taking place behind the scenes. But it is clear that for the PLA Navy, there are certainly capacity constraints and resource limitations. The point that the money that they have isn't infinite, right? They do really need to prioritize, which is something that any naval power will have to deal with. But to me, these are not the most significant development. The most significant development actually comes in the training of the people. We have seen in the recent times, these taking place in the background, which is not much talked about, which is the enhancement of the training of the PLA Navy personnel. You look at, they started doing all the counter-piracy deployments in the Gulf of Aden since December 2008. I think it's pretty clear that they are gradually exposing more of their ships as well as their crew to blue water experience, which is really something that is significant in the light that it is not enough to build a fleet just simply on hardware and software, because end of the day, it is the human capital that really matters, right? They will really have to be proficient in manning the ships, they'll be proficient in maintaining them. So while we had not much information about maintenance, but we do really have quite a bit of information when it comes to their training, their ability to not just operate as a cohesive entity, as a crew on a ship, but they gradually graduated from being operating in small fleets or small flotillas, and now they are graduating themselves to be able to operate not just within their fleet, but also with the other regional fleets within the PLA Navy, right? And as you know, we have 3 regional fleets in total. I mean, the Northern Fleet and the Eastern Fleet and Southern Fleet. And now we see that there is more interactions between the fleets. That is one. And of course, what is even more interesting is the increasing frequency of the PLA Navy training with their other counterparts within the PLA. And in particular, we are talking about joint training with the PLA Army, the joint training with the PLA Rocket Force, for example, and how they come together as an integrated whole. So to me, that aside the fact that they have been building up their hardware and software, that is to me, a way much more significant development that is certainly, warrants a close watch coming in the future.
Right, because when we talk about military modernization, as you just warned us, a lot of people do get carried away with sort of hardware and gadget aspects, right? But in the end, it comes down to what you do with those assets. Joint operations, but also operational and tactical concepts and doctrines and so forth. And that's also definitely that's sort of the development that we do need to watch out for as well, not just the new gadgets that they have. And while we're on the topic of that, on your Twitter, right, you shared a very impressive up-to-date table of U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, FONOPs and transits, right, in the region, including Taiwan Straits. And do you see any patterns regarding sort of U.S. Navy, Coast Guard behavior in the region?
I think this is going to be a pattern that I observe solely based on the very preliminary data sets that I have. And Ryo, thank you so much for highlighting the FONOP table as well as the transit tables. And I'm glad that you actually distinguish between FONOP and the transit, because there are some who mistook those transits through the Taiwan Strait as a FONOP. That is actually not so much a FONOP per se, right? And when we talk about FONOP, we're actually referring to deliberate use of military force to challenge excessive maritime claims. In this sense, the Chinese had not actually challenged international shipping through the Taiwan Strait. They have not gone to the extent of enclosing the Taiwan Strait and then call that internal water so far. And as all of you will know, you go by strictly the UNCLOS definition, much of Taiwan Strait isn't considered what we call straits used for international navigation, right? And these are special regimes for waters that used to be territorial waters back in the past, right? And so in today's context, what we're referring to is actually freedom of navigation in the high seas, because if you minus away the territorial sea belt on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, you actually have a wide, very wide corridor of high seas in total. Nonetheless, through the EEZ, but of course, if you minus away those obligations in the EEZ regime, the high seas rules apply, right? So that is just to give a context. The thing that I thought was interesting is that we are seeing here a pattern of perhaps a monthly transit through the Taiwan Strait by US maritime forces. It could mostly be the US Navy, and it could at times involve the Coast Guard. And that table did not really reflect the true situation, because some of those, some people may think that those transits were very recent, but they are not actually. I only started tabulating them, around 2017. That was around the time when the Taiwan Strait situation has become tenser. But before that, I mean, for these many decades, in fact, if you want to talk about it, even centuries, right? The Taiwan Strait has been a very convenient waterway for transit from the South China Sea to the Northeast Asian waters. And they are fastest, I mean, compared to having to look to the east of Taiwan, that's going to be longer and more circuitous, right? So that has always been the case. But it is only in the recent times that those transits have become much more publicized. And of course, for the US Navy, those transits are meant to send a strong political signal, and that signal is largely revolving around the support for Taiwan against Chinese military provocations, right? So we're not just counting the US maritime forces, but we're also talking about other allied forces. For example, we saw earlier this week, the Canadian Navy actually transited the Taiwan Strait with the US Navy. And earlier, there was a reported instance that was something that was admitted by the French. It is a French Navy intelligence vessel transited the Taiwan Strait. So there are many of these instances, but if we just count the Americans, then we are actually looking at publicized transits like once a month in total. And for the South China Sea, we're not looking at such a high frequency. In fact, we might actually be looking at somewhere around once per 2 months type of 4 knots in total, right? And that to me was interesting because I think on the one hand, it's important to note that the frequency of those operations might actually reflect the priorities of the US administration in terms of the urgency of the matter. So Taiwan Strait is probably and arguably seen as very urgent in terms of the extent of the threat, the extent of the Chinese provocations compared to what you saw in the South China Sea. And at the same time, it might actually reflect the regional sentiments. While in general, in the Southeast Asia, I think there is general, and I would say positive reception towards US military presence in Southeast Asia, which we will talk more about later in our discussion. But I think there is certainly some concerns that, these posturing and counter posturing by the US Navy and the PLA might actually be counterproductive for regional peace and stability. So I was wondering whether that might actually factor into the decision when it comes to planning those 4 knots in the South China Sea. That if you do it too often, will that actually be seen as overly destabilizing? Or if you do too little, and then what is the sort of wrong signals that you send to regional countries regarding your commitment to regional peace and stability? So I thought that is the general pattern that we can get out of the ongoing operations of the US Navy. On top of that, I think there is also a practical issue that we have to consider, that the US Navy today is a shadow of its former self. And there is certainly issue regarding capacity constraints. It's not just about the ships, but also about the crew, right? So how much can you squeeze out of each vessel's ship days out at sea, right? That you have other priorities that you have to attend to. There are other regional security engagement that you have to attend to. There are exercises you have to do with your other regional allies and partners. And just simply making a transit down to the South China Sea to this particular feature is going to take days, right, in total. So it must be weighed as a tactical and operational and even technical consideration. So I think these are the broad patterns that we see so far. Yeah.
Right, and that balance is always hard, right? Like find that optimal balance of what is too much, but what is not enough, right? And you talked about the potential instabilities or so destabilizing effects and so forth, not just by not just to the United States, but also China and so forth. And so if we look at sort of the Indo-Pacific region, we always ask that question, what kind of circumstances are we facing right now, right? And each state or states, have their own interpretations, perceptions, and so forth, regarding the military balance or the balanced power, whatever we want to call it, right? And one of the things that we do see, and we always talk about this, right? Like in our personal chats and so forth, is that military modernization is taking place. Military transformation is taking place, right? But military modernization and transformation come in various shapes and sizes, obviously, right? Because it's much based on the nation's strategic demands, but also political, economic, and even social conditions and circumstance and other factors as well, right? And so, yeah, there's no one size fits all definition of military modernization or transformation in the Indo-Pacific. But that said, there are still some kinds of patterns, right? And that's, it's our job as analysts to try and work those patterns out, right? Whether it be to the action-reaction dynamics between states, right? Or particular threats and concerns that are common in the region, and so on, right? But regarding Southeast Asia, right, where various developments are taking place, right, again, in various shapes and sizes, what do you see, right? We have, all these different navies in Southeast Asia, some very big, some very small, but what kinds of keys or patterns or developments do you see in the region?
Yeah, thank you, Ryo. And I particularly like your observation about no one size fit all, because the existing commentaries tend to conflict the region together when it comes to military modernization. And we do see different patterns taking place in the different sub-regions within the Indo-Pacific, right? For example, in Northeast Asia, which is where you come from, you observe a very different set of nuances when it comes to the dynamic of arms modernization between the regional countries. Whereas in Southeast Asia, there is a very different set. And in general, you could actually categorize. I mean, we tend to like to pigeonhole, items, right? So if you want to pigeonhole, then we can regard the Southeast Asians as belonging to what we call the small boys league when it comes to modernization, not just naval modernization, but across the board for the various services, right? And the big boys are very often, our regional major powers and middle powers, like, for example, China in particular, Japan, Korea, India, Australia. The type of armament choices and the type of modernization approach that they undertake are very unique, right? Say, for example, it actually was Northeast Asia and then in South Asia or Indian Ocean that we saw the emergence of supersonic anti-ship missiles before you actually see the pattern taking place in Southeast Asia, right? And there are some general concerns about, to what extent you react to those neighboring dynamics. That's one. So if you go by, the traditional literature on, arms dynamic or arms races, right? We can actually look at three types of drivers. And the first type is what we call the interactive drivers of arms racing or arms dynamic. And interactive tends to be conflated with threat perception. Not entirely true, because if you look at interactive drivers, there are two types of interactive drivers. One is what we call the classical threat perception, action-reaction type of drivers for arms dynamic. But there's another type that is, I would see as the most common factor in Southeast Asia, is the technological determinism dimension when it comes to that interaction. So in other words, we're talking about what we call, catching up with the Joneses, right? That we are not arming against the other country. We arm because we feel that the other country has a certain capability, and if we don't acquire that, we will lag behind. Not because I want to fight the other guy, but it's because I feel that, I will be lagging behind in the curve, right? And then I need to catch up. So that is quite different from threat perception. It could be combined with threat perception, but not necessarily, a mutually reinforcing type of thing, right? So in Southeast Asia, these tend to be a major driver. A good example would be submarines, right? That, there are some countries in Southeast Asia which acquire submarines because they probably feel that there are some residual distrust, and there is some residual disputes that need to be contained, right? And then they definitely feel there is a threat perception. But in the recent years, the second type of interactive driver that I'm talking about has become more prominent, that countries, they buy submarines not necessarily because they feel there's a threat, but they argue that our neighbors have it, so we need to have it. And a good example would be Thailand, right? Because some will be asking, so with submarines, what are you intending to fight against, right? And for the Thais, the most straightforward argument would be Myanmar is the one, right? Because of their long-standing history. But that was not so the case in the recent years. But if you look at the very recent slew of statements coming out from Bangkok, whether it comes from the Royal Thai Navy or it comes from the defense planners, there is a very common thread of what they say. And that thread is that, other countries in our neighborhood have the weapon, so we need to have it as well. So that is a very typical catching up with Joneses type of thing. So be that as it may, while these are the drivers, it's important to note there are other legitimate reasons behind why armaments were being sought after. One of which being what we call the non-interactive driver, that is the need for maintenance, right? That hardware they wear off and they get obsolete, and it became too expensive to simply upgrade them. So it is cheaper actually to acquire something new to replace them. So that is one non-interactive driver that is prominent in the region as well. But that be that as it may, the patterns that we saw is that when it comes to the very high-end type of technologies like hypersonic weapon, I think Southeast Asia is very far away from that so far, because we are still on the throes of acquiring supersonic anti-ship missiles. I mean, Indonesia and Vietnam so far are the only countries that have acquired such a capability, but the remainder majority of the Southeast Asian navies have not. And we are likely going to see a continued focus on certain types of preferred platforms. For example, there will continue to be a preference for frigate-type forces. Frigate-type forces that are not entirely the type of specialized or optimized platform that we saw in Northeast Asia. For example, the acquisition of Aegis equipped ships, which are optimized for air defense or optimized for ballistic missile defense. That was the case for Australia as well. But in Southeast Asia, what you actually saw will be the preference for what we call general purpose ships. General purpose ships that are multi-function in nature. That's one. Second also is they are cheaper to acquire, cheaper to operate, and they could serve for a longer period of time, right? So you'll find those ships that come, they will be modular in nature, and the whole idea is that they're supposed to serve for more than or longer than the intended lifespan. That is one. Second is they're supposed to be tailored for a various type of missions across the spectrum. So frigates of multi-purpose type. Submarines, we won't expect nuclear submarines because after AUKUS came in last month, there was some talk about arms race in the region with nuclear submarines. That may be the case for Northeast Asia, that may be the case for India, that may be the case for Australia, but that's not definitely the case for Southeast Asia, right? We are still struggling to acquire even conventional submarines, and for people to talk about Southeast Asia being involved in the nuclear sub game, I think that is very much in the realm of fantasy so far. So we won't expect that. So even when we talk about amphibious ships, we are also not expecting Southeast Asia to go right deep into large through deck carrier, something like what you have in the background right now, Izumo class, right? We might see some navies, a select few navies who might be dabbling with that, right? But I think for the most part, we are expecting in the longer term, navies in Southeast Asia acquiring what we call landing platform docks, type of, much more manageable, cheaper type of, landing ships that are large enough to conduct, HADR operations and limited conventional operations. And on top of that, of course, I think the quest to improve their maritime domain awareness is something that we cannot overlook. So we are still going to see much more emphasis on acquiring the tools for that, say radar systems, unmanned aerial vehicles, AIS systems, LRIT, as well as new, if possible, new maritime patrol and reconnaissance aircraft. So these are the type of platforms that actually come across as more useful. So in a nutshell, Southeast Asian countries are definitely keen to acquire high-end equipment, but there is a very circumscribed set of equipment that they are actually looking at, and that is largely based on national interest, their more immediate threat perception, as well as their domestic circumstances. That in particular, we talk about funding. Funding is a big problem, and going down into the near future, I think we have to take into account COVID-19 is going to have a long-term effect on acquisition. We're going to see some countries get very much affected by this for many years to come. The only way to do that probably is to try to take loans, right? We saw Indonesia doing that, but in Indonesia right now, that might solve the problem of getting the hard cash to buy your equipment. But people in Indonesia were asking this one very big pertinent question. So are we going to incur long-term intergenerational debt to cover, right? As it stands right now, the total debt that was accumulated by the Indonesian government is almost 500 billion US dollars in total. And so how much more do we need to accumulate just because we need to buy some spanky new toys, and then there is a need to spruce up your public health care, there's a need to spruce up your social security. So these are questions that I believe Southeast Asia, which are more preoccupied with social economic development, will have very much to think about. Yeah.
Right, and that also means that there has to be greater focus on efficiency, cost effectiveness, and so forth, right? So as you said, like well, high-end capabilities, that can mean a lot of things, right? It doesn't necessarily talk about aircraft carriers, amphibious assault ships, and so forth, right? And so from what I gather, right, if I heard you right, is that things such as Japan's Mogami class, right, multi-role frigates, they're the kinds of capabilities that you're saying will be the future for a lot of Southeast Asian navies, right? It's modular, it's multi-purpose, and so forth, right? And again, so to zoom out a little bit from Southeast Asia and look at some naval warfare overall, right? Again, it's not really good to pigeonhole things, but we hear a lot about some new and emerging technologies, right? Be it hypersonics, including railguns, laser weapons, right? AI, quantum computing, and so forth, right? We hear about all these new technologies that are, supposedly going to, transform or revolutionize warfare and so forth, right? Now, when we look at such capabilities, right, or technologies, I should say, and when we think of the future of naval warfare, if you look into a crystal ball, do you see major transformations in naval warfare due to these technologies or not? Because, again, we often talk about some sharper and stronger strategies and readiness pursued by various states, right? And obviously, they're starting to look at new emerging technologies like the one that I just talked about, right? But in terms of consequences, in terms of results, do you foresee some kind of transformation in naval warfare? Like, do we see revolutionary effects on these things, or is it still sort of shrouded in mystery?
Very good question, and again, we often ask ourselves the question about whether those transformational patterns are in fact revolutionary or evolutionary, right? And as far as based on what we saw today, I think the trend line is very much more into evolutionary than revolutionary, right? Because some of the things that we saw taking place today and in the very, very not so distant past is that naval warfare has become increasingly under strain. I mean, by what I mean is that in today's context, there are many circumstances to consider. One is that navies are not actually growing, right? Navies in some ways are shrinking, right? I mean, not counting the PLA Navy. They shrink in some areas, but they grow in some other areas, right? But for the most part, in general, we could safely say and assume that navies are shrinking. We're looking at navies that operate fewer platforms, and largely is all down to cost, right? That end of the day, building a navy, operating a navy is exorbitantly expensive, right? And on top of that, the other associated issue is how do you recruit enough people to man the ships, right? So you're not just talking about shrinking navies in terms of assets, you're also talking about shrinking navies in terms of manpower, right? Because end of the day, if you don't count the current COVID-19 situation, the offshore industry and the other types of commercial maritime sectors are actually more lucrative in terms of the benefits, and people tend to be drawn to that. And who wants to, say, for example, be locked up in a steel cylinder out in the open sea, and have no internet access for more than 5 days in a row? And even if they're on the surface, they don't get guaranteed internet access, they don't get the connectivity. It does require a very different breed to be in the naval service, even till this day, right? And all the more so that there are competing social and cultural pressures on this, right? So in total, it means that navies have to be very careful in the way they deploy and employ their assets and manpower. And that only means that in a real situation of a conflict, every ship, every crew is so valuable, right? And that leads to the question of whether do you want to risk it all. We have here two extreme situations in an envisaged future naval warfighting scenario. Either because you are so concerned about the risk that you take, you decided not to take any action at all. And the other extreme end is because the other opposing party is probably as well equipped as you are, and you are so afraid of losing your ship and your men that you believe that you have to preempt, right? So these are conditions that were talked about way in the past, to be honest. And what we saw today is that emergence of AI, the emergence of machine learning, the emergence of hypersonic, supersonic, strike systems merely worsen the situation, right? That if you have AI, then the question to have is, if you have AI or machine learning enabled decision making, right? The command and control will become transformed, right? It is not exactly revolutionary, but it merely sort of shrank or compressed the command and control loop in that sense, right? Will that actually lead to a greater tendency of preemption when it comes to naval actions or the threat or use of force out there at sea, right? So that is one. With the other party securing a hypersonic weapon, will the other party, which has no such weapon, decide that the best way to preserve your fighting ability is to strike first with whatever you have, right? So the pressure to actually use force at sea could have commensurately increased. And that, of course, that is not revolutionary. I mean, it's just that, those technologies have reinforced these trends, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, and that seems to be the key word, right, that we often miss, and that's evolutionary, right? Because, from what we just discussed, we do see a lot of these new and emerging technologies, particularly AI, quantum computing, and other sort of knowledge-based systems, accelerating, extending, or enhancing, right? A lot of the things that we already have, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a big 180 or 360 turn, right, on things, right? And that's something that we do need to definitely think about. Also, some other stuff that's often discussed is, will these new and emerging technologies sort of transform or change significantly the theory of victory, right? How militaries employ, what is of what are the strategies and tactics and so forth to win wars and all of that as well. And you talked about human resources. That's definitely one very important thing, because it's always frustrating when people talk about military modernization. They focus on the gadgets, but they don't focus on some of the logistical aspects, right? And that is very important, right? That's makes or breaks military readiness, because there is a difference between military capabilities and military readiness. Because military readiness is about how the states and the militaries can employ or mobilize the capabilities that they have, right? And so when we look at the human resources, you talked about recruitment and retention and so forth, but there's also the education and training aspect, which is obviously going to be more challenging when we bring in new technology and so forth as well, right? Now, with all of that, right, we see how military modernization, transformation, the pursuit of sharper and stronger capability, readiness, and strategies and so forth are taking place. but they come in sort of, again, various shapes and sizes in the Indo-Pacific, right? Now, just going back to macro about sort of the Indo-Pacific and also particularly Southeast Asia, what are some of the biggest misunderstandings about the region, in your opinion? We talked about some of those already, but if there are just some quick sort of points they can raise here regards the major misunderstandings and misconceptualization, what are they?
Thank you, Ryo. I will list two. And certainly the first one, since we are talking about transformation, I think the first one is to assume that Southeast Asia is monolithic, right? And very often in the commentaries out there, there is a tendency to conflate Southeast Asia as a monolithic region. That is not true. Within Southeast Asia, there is a diversity of countries with very, very different national contexts. Be it you talk about the economic ability, you talk about the technological ability, and the human resources. And the discrepancies vary very widely throughout Southeast Asia. So when we talk about the extent of military modernization and transformation, there is no one-size-fits-all analysis for Southeast Asia. You have to look at each country one by one, right? So it's not always easy to do that, but for the sake of so-called academic parsimony, people tend to conflate together. But from the analytical perspective, that is not going to give or yield any real or deep insights on Southeast Asia. There are many nuances. So that is the first misconception, right? The second misconception, if you could allow me to zoom out of the technological aspect, is more to do with, the earlier, related point about Southeast Asia being diverse and essentially, made out of 10 different countries with their own different national interests. The one misconception, which I thought is very important to raise, is that one sentence: the South China Sea is a Southeast Asia primary maritime security problem. That is not true. That is a downright misconception. While in Southeast Asia, it's true that because of geographical contiguity, the South China Sea is important. But to say that the South China Sea dispute is the primary security concern for Southeast Asian countries missed the point. In Southeast Asia, if you go and survey those policymakers and the academics, in many of them, you will yield a very, very interesting mixed picture. Where, for example, in Vietnam, while you could find many academics looking at, for example, South China Sea as a big security problem, and you can even count on the officials to say the same thing. But if you ask many other Southeast Asian countries, right, their problem, the most pertinent security problem out there at sea, isn't so much the South China Sea, to be honest. Their main problem has always been the day-to-day issues. For example, smuggling, trafficking, illegal fishing, for example, right? And in the current pandemic era, you'll find that even being borne out more prominently, that maritime forces in Southeast Asia are largely consigned to border surveillance and security. In fact, just simply to keep out, COVID-19 entry, or to keep out or sort of address COVID-related smuggling, for example. So these are the pertinent issues on the day-to-day basis that actually border Southeast Asia. While the South China Sea is important, but it is important, I think, for all our audience sake, I think it's important to highlight that we should not overly exaggerate that point. Yeah.
Right. And just as a sort of final question, adding to that, do the Southeast Asian states feel more protected by sort of this greater involvement by super and great powers, or do they feel more vulnerable? Because again, the South China Sea issue is a issue, but not the issue. From the perspective of many Southeast Asian states, right? And there's a lot of other things that they're looking at, and obviously they are sensitive to some of the new developments in the Indo-Pacific, broadly, right? And as you said, there's an episode for each country regarding their threat perceptions, the strategies that they're pursuing and so forth. So with that in mind, again, do the Southeast Asian states feel more protected, with more great power involvement, or the other way around? Again, this is going to depend on which country we're talking about, but what do you see overall?
Thank you. Thank you, Ryo. So I will bear in mind that what we just discussed earlier about the non-monolithic or heterogeneous nature of Southeast Asia. So with that in mind, we can roughly draw out some important generalization, right? That in general, in Southeast Asia, there has always been the quest to maintain agency. This is something that was often missed out in the media, which is also another big misconception that Southeast Asia has always been painted as that weak, simply helpless region that falls to the whims and fancies of the great powers. Well, that is very much romanticized in the media, but very often missed out is the agency that Southeast Asian countries exercise. And the agency that's exercised is merely for one single purpose, which is to maintain strategic autonomy, right? And so with that in mind, it's important to note that if we look at Southeast Asia from that lens, it will not be difficult to underline and try to decipher what they're exactly trying to do. Some sort of, describe it as hedging, right? But the thing is that hedging, depending on what literature you're looking at, some will disagree that that is hedging. But in general, we will agree that Southeast Asian countries do hedge. They hedge, and it depends on what type of interest they're looking at. And in general, Southeast Asian countries will want to stay out of great powers rivalries. They do not want to be caught in between, but at the same time, they wanted to benefit from the great powers interactions in the region. That, of course, also ties in with the broader separate literature on ASEAN, right? That is the ASEAN way is about being inclusive in the security architecture. But if we put that aside, if we just go down to the national interest of Southeast Asian countries, it's basically to gain strategic autonomy, maintain it and enhance it. So back to the question of whether Southeast Asian countries feel more vulnerable or they feel more protected with greater major power involvement, that is where the nuance comes. On the one hand, it goes in line with the idea that there is strategic autonomy being exercised. For example, Southeast Asian countries, many of them actually, have for many decades since the end of the Second World War been involved with many joint training events with the major powers. Right? We talk about Australia, we talk about US, we talk about Great Britain, for example. Right? These are those interactions that have been ongoing. And there is no reason from the institutional perspective as well as from the geopolitical perspective to give them up, right? And you use it as a way to highlight your national sovereignty, to highlight your strategic autonomy. So involving these actors in the region in terms of a host of engagement, be it joint exercises or even for the US to come in to do FORNOC every now and then, is a manifestation of that autonomy. At the same time, there is certainly, concerns about the consequences, right? That these major power involvement in the region and the increased interactions between their military forces with China in particular may lead to some sort of a clash, accidental, inadvertent, whatever you want to call that. These are real concerns. But then again, it's important to note that we do have existing mechanisms to mitigate that or prevent that. And I don't see Southeast Asian countries overlooking that aspect. So it's a matter of managing, right? That on the one hand, you are keen to maintain those engagements and keep these major powers committed to the region so that you can feel more secure. And in this current context, when we're talking about a post-COVID-19 world, when defense dollars may be stretched, I think all the more we will expect Southeast Asian countries to put more emphasis on tying in or locking in these great power involvement in the region to promote that stability so it could induce or promote that environment that can lead them to focus on pandemic control and economic recovery, right? The issue here is how to manage it. And I think Southeast Asian countries do want to bank on, the ASEAN frameworks, as well as, propelling or trying to push US and China to some form of an accommodation of sort, right? So I don't see Southeast Asian countries generally feeling, more insecure or more secure. I think we are seeing a very nuanced and mixed picture here. It is contradictory. I don't know that is whether that is the best answer to your question. But I think this is the sort of complexity we have in Southeast Asia, that we want this, but we also don't want that. And how do we reconcile these differences together? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's about it's really, well, I mean, you use word hedging, but it's also about balance, right? Balance management, all these different priorities, genders, and perceptions, and so forth. And so your points, I think, really serve as a good reminder about how we can better understand the region, not just Southeast Asia, but the Indo-Pacific overall, because often we tend to lose sight of the sort of country, region specifics that provide that important context. Yeah. It's easy to talk about sort of what, who, where, when, where, and so forth, but we often do not talk enough about sort of how and why, right? And that's the important part. And we also need to think about structures, process, and circumstances that are specific to the particular countries and also regions. And so there's this tendency to oversimplify or overlook important factors. As we got from the discussion concerning the Pacific region, but also particularly the Southeast Asia region, where there's a lot of color, if I can put it in that way, right? And where things are extremely complex, as you have just very well described. And I think that has major consequences. Given the importance of the region, not only for the Southeast Asian countries themselves, but also for global trade, supply chain, transport, and also just general geopolitical security issues, right? And so thank you, Collin. As always, it's really great to chat with you, right? And you actually raise a lot of new questions that we have to talk about. And so, be sure I'll be dragging you in for another episode, sometime soon, right? And yes, dinner is on me, but I'll drag you in anyhow, right? And yeah, your insights, as always, very valuable, right? And it's perfect to kickstart this Rose Talk series.
Yeah, well, Ryo, thank you so much for inviting me to this inaugural session. I thought that is a very comprehensive discussion we have, and as you mentioned, if we don't put a time limit to that, we can actually go on for endless periods of time. And
live streaming, right?
Yeah, live streaming. So I will be certainly looking forward to the opportunity to come and share my perspective again. And of course, offline we can have more discussions after that. But I just want to also say, enjoy the beer as well, right? Other than, yeah. So hopefully, after COVID-19 and all the issues will resolve and the travel get eased, we can catch up, and then hopefully we can talk more about these issues. But really, thank you so much. And I understand that for our discussion, there are some issues that I may not have been able to cover too in depth. And there could be some questions that require clarification. So I will welcome any of our audience here. If you have any questions or anything you need to seek clarification, don't hesitate to contact me. You'll find my email very easily online anyway. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and we could even set up like an episode where we answer questions, right?
Oh, that's good.
That'll be an interesting one.
That'll be good. Yeah. That'll be good. Yeah, look forward to that.
Yeah. So thank you as always.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah.
And so that's it for this episode of Rose Talk. Thank you for tuning in. And please also don't forget to subscribe to our channel, as we bring you many episodes featuring a variety of rich discussions, some great guests. So stay tuned and take care.